Well, look who is back in the news. All right. So, this is an article from December 2022. And it says a new lawsuit alleges JP Morgan facilitated Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking scheme. The U.S. Virgin Islands attorney also claims the bank covered up its involvement and that red flag laws were ignored until after Epstein's death. A new lawsuit from U.S. Virgin Island Attorney General Denise George accuses J.P. Morgan Chase of facilitating Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking scheme and covering it up. Human trafficking, the lawsuit alleges, was the principal business of Jeffrey Epstein's account at the bank, but the bank turned a blind eye for more than a decade because of the details and clients Epstein brought and promised to bring to the bank. Epstein died in jail in 2019 while awaiting trial on trafficking charges. His death unleashed a flood of litigation over the $630 million fortune he left behind in a compensation fund for more than 200 people who claimed to be his victims. Earlier this year, the U.S. Virgin Islands settled a separate lawsuit first brought in 2020 with Epstein's estate and its executors. The estate was required to pay $150 million in addition to half of the proceeds from the sale of Little St. James. The new lawsuit filed on Tuesday emerged from the same investigation and alleges J.P. Morgan knowingly facilitated, sustained, and concealed the human trafficking network operated by Jeffrey Epstein and financially benefited from its participation. J.P. Morgan knowingly negligently and unlawfully provided and pulled the levers through which recruiters and victims were paid and was indispensable to the operation and concealment of the Epstein trafficking enterprise, the lawsuit said. So here's Denise George, former U.S. Virgin Island Attorney General Denise George. Denise George, the now former Attorney General of U.S. Virgin Islands, has been fired days after she filed a lawsuit against J.P. Morgan Chase in New York that accused the company of aiding Jeffrey Epstein in the illegal exploitation and sex trafficking of women and children. So far, the Virgin Islands governor has not given any clear reason for George's sudden dismissal, so you already know the fine folks on social media are filling in the blanks by suggesting Epstein is still being protected posthumously by elites who are invested in keeping the lid on Epstein's rabbit hole. Well, maybe. Attorney General has been terminated. Denise George served as the Virgin Island Attorney General for 4 years during the Bryan administration's first term, was terminated December 31st. The decision by Governor Bryan to fire her came days after Bloomberg News revealed that Ms. George, in her capacity as Attorney General, had fired a lawsuit against J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States and the world's largest bank by market capitalization, without first informing Governor Bryan of such a major action. The lawsuit claims J.P. Morgan Chase facilitated convicted felon Jeffrey Epstein's abuse of women and girls, alleging that the bank should have known about Epstein's illegal activity and, as part of its anti-money laundering procedures, should have reported their client to authorities. Yeah, they done fucked her. Okay, sorry, Denise, that happened to you. One of Epstein's accounts with JP Morgan, named Southern Trust, didn't perform the cutting-edge consulting services Epstein claimed. It was a conduit for payment to foreign women, credit cards, airplanes, and other instrumentalities. The bank and its employees knew they were facilitating Epstein's sexual abuse and sex trafficking conspiracy to coerce young women and underage girls to engage in commercial sex acts. But according to the suit, the banks concealed its conduct by failing to comply with red flag laws. The section of the lawsuit that details how JP Morgan allegedly turned a blind eye to Epstein's conduct is heavily redacted. JP Morgan ignored numerous red flags and failed to comply with federal banking regulations until years after JP Morgan was no longer benefiting from Epstein's businesses. The decision to keep Epstein as a client and to move his money around were advocated and approved at the senior levels of JP Morgan, including by former chief executive of its asset management division who had an inappropriate relationship with Epstein. Staley stepped down from his position as CEO of Barclays in 2021. That was December. She was fired in January. And now let me bring you to today. 1 hour ago, Jeffrey Epstein uses U.S. Virgin Islands First Lady to remain unchecked in sex trafficking scheme. May 24th, that is today. This was 2 hours ago now. J.P. Morgan wants to shift blame to the U.S. Virgin Islands over connection to Jeffrey Epstein. The now former First Lady was Epstein's primary conduit for local power, J.P. Morgan says in a new filing. Epstein avoided oversight, even though he was a registered sex offender in exchange for money, per J.P. Morgan. New filings in the messy lawsuit between U.S. Virgin Islands and J.P. Morgan Chase over who bears responsibility for Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking operations are dragging former U.S. Virgin Island First Lady Cecile DeJong in the spotlight. On Tuesday, U.S. District Judge Jed Rakoff, who is overseeing the lawsuit, ordered Jeffrey Epstein's estate to produce all emails and other documents referencing her. On May 17th, defendant J.P. Morgan Chase moved to compel production of two categories of documents. 1. All email correspondence in the possession, custody, and control of the estate containing Cecile DeJong in 24cc line. All documents in the possession, custody, and control of the estate that hit on the search term Cecile, CDG, or DeJong that are not already captured by category 1 prior to production of the estate. Their full consideration of limited, blah, blah, blah. On the same day, J.P. Morgan alleged in its own filing that she, DeJong, was Epstein's primary conduit for spreading money and influence throughout the U.S. Virgin Island government. Unequivocally, a political culture was fostered within the local Democratic Party of the Virgin Islands that allowed Epstein to remain unchecked in exchange for his sponsorship and financial contributions. The U.S. Virgin Island is complicit in the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein could have lived anywhere in the world. He chose the U.S. Virgin Islands. Discovery obtained in this case reveal why. For 2 decades, Epstein maintained a quid pro quo relationship with the U.S. Virgin Islands' highest-ranking officials. He gave them money, advice, influence, and favors. In exchange, they shielded and even rewarded him, granting him more than some odd millions in tax incentives. Something else. Looked the other way when he walked through U.S. Virgin Island airports accompanied by girls and young women for 2 decades and for long after J.P. Morgan Chase exited Epstein as a client. The entity that most directly failed to protect public safety and most actively facilitated and benefited from Epstein's continued criminal activity was the plaintiff in this case, the U.S. Virgin Island government itself. Though the U.S. Virgin Island government hopes to shroud itself in exemptions, it is a plaintiff in civil litigations like any other. Tellingly, the U.S. Virgin Islands motions seek to strike only those specific defenses that threaten to expose its relationship with Epstein. The law affords defendants equitable defenses to protect them against precisely this sort of one-sided presentation of the evidence. This court should see that USVI's gambit for what it is and deny its motion. Discovery in this case is ongoing, but has established at least the following. In 2009, upon his release from prison for procuring a minor for prostitution, Epstein sought to arrange for supervision of his parole to be transferred from Florida to the U.S. Virgin Islands. He registered with the U.S. Virgin Islands as a sex offender in 2010 and maintained his primary residence there. This put him under USVI law enforcement's direct jurisdiction and supervision. The decades-long quid pro quo between Epstein and the United States Virgin Island government took 3 forms. First, high-ranking USVI officials spent years courting and gladly accepting Epstein's influence in the form of gifts, favors, and political donations. Second, in exchange, U.S. Virgin Island granted Epstein's preferential treatment in the forms of more than however many million in tax incentives, among other benefits. Third, and most troubling, United States Virgin Island protected Epstein, fostering the perfect conditions for Epstein's criminal conduct to continue undetected. Rather than stop him, they helped him. Epstein's primary conduit for spreading money and influence throughout the United States Virgin Island government was First Lady DeJong. See Exhibit 19. Quote, Epstein has contributed to the political campaigns of various senatorial, gubernatorial, and congressional candidates within the local Democratic Party. Unequivocally, a political culture was fostered within the local Democratic Party of the Virgin Islands that allowed Epstein to remain unchecked in exchange for his sponsorship and financial contributions. And the relationship went deeper. Despite her public role and financial duties, First Lady DeJong managed Epstein's U.S. Virgin Island-based companies, receiving from Epstein a salary, bonuses, and other benefits. Lest there be any doubt Epstein's goal, she told him, and it suggests Epstein's explored paying. I mean, listen, we don't get to see this, but somebody for sure knows exactly what this says. Probably First Lady DeJong. Epstein got what he paid for. For example, Epstein's donations to Congresswoman Plaskett bought him easy access. In fact, Miss Plaskett went to New York and met with Epstein in his townhome in Manhattan less than a year before his arrest on federal sex trafficking charges in 2019. In addition to accepting payments from Epstein and giving him who knows what, along with over however many millions in tax incentives, the United States Virgin Island government officials actively facilitated Epstein's crimes. Further, while the U.S. Virgin Islands did conduct site visits at Epstein's residence, those inspections were cursory at best. Despite the direct infusion of lucrative tax incentives and law enforcement, Epstein still could not freely transport and exploit young women without assistance from the government officials. Finally, to get to Epstein Island, the victim needed to fly to and from the airport run by the United States Virgin Island Port Authority, where Epstein leased hangar space. Given the extent of his use of the services, Epstein met with somebody often. In particular, Epstein had close ties to somebody else based on the government connections. When traveling through the USVI's airport, accompanied by young women as registered sex offender, Epstein could count on his whatever with whoever to avoid scrutiny and detection. And when he did encounter difficulties, Epstein had but to email who knows who at who knows where to get who knows what. In exchange for Epstein's cash and gifts, the United States Virgin Islands made life easy for him. The government mitigated any burdens from his sex offender status, and it made sure that no one asked too many questions about his transport and keeping of young girls on his island. United States Virgin Islands seek to avoid accountability by moving to strike. Rather than investigating its own 20-year history of enabling Epstein's criminal activity, United States Virgin Islands filed this action against J.P. Morgan Chase. In keeping with its effort to avoid accountability and to purge the record of inconvenient facts, United States Virgin Islands moved to strike J.P. Morgan Chase's 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th affirmative defense. As grounds, U.S. Virgin Islands argues that it would be burdened by the additional discovery these defenses purportedly require. But striking J.P. Morgan Chase's valid affirmative defense will not change the scope of United States Virgin Islands discovery obligations. Indeed, discovery has all but ended. This motion does not seek to shield United States Virgin Islands from intrusive discovery. It attempts to insulate U.S. Virgin Islands from legitimate questions about its complicity in an Epstein sex trafficking venture. It should be denied.
Okay, so to make a long story just a little bit longer, I hope you followed this. I realized I was talking kind of fast, and I thought about slowing it down, but I didn't want to sound drunk. Anyway, back in the day, Jeffrey Epstein did what he did in Florida. They gave him a slap on the wrist. He had to register as a sex offender, and he moved to the Virgin Islands, where he was facilitated both by the government there in the Virgin Islands, and which is the United States Virgin, so our government, if you're in the United States like I am, and the United States' largest bank, J.P. Morgan Chase. Both facilitated this man's degeneracy for years and years and years, and it sounds like they accidentally got a based attorney general who thought she discovered something, filed a lawsuit, got fired for following that lawsuit, but the cat was out of the bag, and now we have the U.S. Virgin Island government versus J.P. Morgan Chase fighting what seems to be a Rico case on Pedo Island regarding who did more protecting for this sicko. Meanwhile, Kanye's like, wait, so what I did was worse because remember what you did to me? So that's what's happening in the wild world of Rico Island.